Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the 7th and final public event in a 2-week-long conference, Informal, Criminalized, Precarious Sex Workers Organizing Against Barriers. My name is Lorelei Lee, and I'm a sex worker activist, writer, and organizer. I'm a co-founder of the Disabled Sex Workers Coalition, a founding member of both the Upstate New York Sex Workers Coalition and Decrim Massachusetts, a researcher and analyst with Hacking Hustling, and a Justice Catalyst Fellow at the Cornell Gender Justice Clinic. The Sex Workers Organizing Against Barriers Conference is co-facilitated by the Disabled Sex Workers Coalition, Hacking Hustling, Cornell Law School Gender Justice Clinic, Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I am so grateful for the incredible work of our conference co-organizers, Rachel Kuo, Danielle Blunt, Zara Stardust, and Tiffany So. And I'm also so grateful to our co-sponsors, the Berger International Legal Studies Program, the Dorothy S. Clark Program in Feminist Jurisprudence, the Cornell Labor Law Clinic, the Cornell student chapters of Outlaw, National Lawyers Guild, Women's Law Coalition, and Black Law Students Association, Justice Catalyst, the Red Umbrella Fund, and the Asian American Feminist Collective. Special thanks also to Naomi Loren, Eves, and Alexis Briggs for all of your work and support. As I think you all can probably tell, this conference was born out of a lot of collective work and a lot of collective dreaming. Thank you also to all of you who have donated via the Eventbrite page. Our co-sponsors and our public donations ensure that we can follow one of our core ethics in this organizing, which is to pay people for their labor. In particular, sex worker organizers who do so much work that is unrecognized and unfunded. For each of our conference panels, closed captioning and streaming to YouTube are available, and recordings and transcripts will be available afterward at hackinghustling.org. Our community agreements are adapted from the Asian American Feminist Collective. I'm so sorry, I just lost my place. Our community agreements are adapted from the Asian American Feminist Collective, Brave Space, Collective Sex, Alt-Div Hummingbirds, and By Us, For Us, and are as follows. First, to bring in our histories and to speak from our own experiences. Second, to be committed to each other's collective learning and growing. Third, to be open to learning. Fourth, to respect the diversity of our identities, which particularly for the purposes of this conference means not assuming the identities of organizers and activists for whom sharing every element of our lived experience is not always safe. This also includes not dead naming or doxing anyone. In other words, not sharing anyone else's personal information without their consent. Fifth, to practice not using ableist language. And sixth, to prioritize care for ourselves and each other. This last agreement in particular is a disability justice issue, and both our panelists and our audience members should feel free to do whatever is needed to care for yourselves throughout this conference, including standing up, moving around, lying down, or even disengaging from any of the events at any time. Many of our panelists throughout this conference are zooming in from North America or Australia, where we are living on stolen land, land that is still and always Indigenous land. To learn more about the land you're living on, you can look to the resources provided by the Native Governance Center at nativegov.org. Today's panel is on decriminalization campaigns in the United States, and will feature about 60 minutes of conversation with our speakers, followed by a Q&A if we have time. You're welcome to use the Q&A or the chat features on Zoom to ask questions throughout, and we'll answer as many of them as possible at the end. And now I have the great joy of introducing our panelists. Michael Cox is the executive director of Black and Pink Massachusetts, a prison abolition organization that supports LGBTQI+ people and those living with HIV. After serving a 6-year prison sentence, Mike was inspired to dismantle the criminal legal system. He is also a former sex worker. Marika Maypop is an autonomous organizer, Buddhist Dharma teacher, and sex worker of 16 years, born, raised, and living in the American South. She currently organizes with the Sex Workers Advisory Committee on the Deep South Decrim campaign to decriminalize sex work in the state of Louisiana. TS Candii is a leader in the social justice movement for Black and Brown trans civil rights. And as a former sex worker, TS Candii uses her firsthand experience with racial and transgender profiling, as well as employment and housing discrimination, to expose the roots of transphobia and white supremacy. In 2020, TS Candii founded Black Trans Nation and Black Trans Nation New York, organizations which seek to uplift Black and Brown trans people and gender nonconforming people through advocacy for policy changes and helping get trans people elected to public office. She has been a leader in the movement to ban the policing practice of arresting trans women for soliciting prostitution, also known as walking while trans. Her work, along with many others, saw the law officially repealed and expunged on February 2nd, 2021. Lakeisha Harris is the Director of Reproductive Health and Justice at Women with a Vision. Previous positions held by Lakeisha include being a health educator, community health worker, and alternative insemination coordinator at Chicago Women's Health Center, one of the last remaining feminist health centers in the country. As a community leader, Lakeisha's primary focus is on centering complete healthcare access for Black people, specifically queer and trans Black people, who are often shut out of services that are culturally affirming, financially accessible, and whole being centered. Lakeisha holds a bachelor's degree in women and gender studies from Northeastern Illinois University and master's level credits in political science. In 2011, she was selected as a student laureate of Northeastern Illinois University and received numerous awards for her work as a community activist, poet, and one of the founders of Seeds Literary Arts Journal of Northeastern Illinois University. She's a playwright whose collaborative political literary work, Spirit House, was commissioned by the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center for the educational engagement and healing of the community. As a practicing healer, her work has spanned more than 2 decades and evolved from her roots as a certified nurse assistant, doula, apprentice midwife, and community health worker. Lakeisha was recently trained as a street medic with Chicago Action Medical and is a practicing Reiki master teacher. And Ivanalise Rivera has been in leadership at Whose Corner Is It Anyway since April 2018, where her responsibilities have included mutual aid, managing supply distribution logistics, and criminal justice programming. She is currently the outreach coordinator at Whose Corner, and in that capacity coordinates material assistance to the most vulnerable members of the organization, as well as doing tech support for the leadership team and others, including myself. Ivanalise was part of the spring 2020 team that implemented a total organizational rehaul at Whose Corner in response to COVID-19. She is also a founding member of Decrim Massachusetts, a grassroots coalition of sex workers fighting for liberation and genuine safety on our own terms via the full decriminalization of sex work in the state of Massachusetts. Ivanalise is excited to delve further into policy advocacy and has a passion for directly serving her community of current and former sex workers who use drugs. So welcome everyone. I'm so thrilled to have you all here, and panelists, you should feel free to turn on your video if that is comfortable for you, or to keep it turned off if that's more comfortable. But I would love to dive into our questions. And our first question is to clear up some public confusion around our topic. I think a lot of people out there are a little bit confused by the terms decriminalization, legalization. Sometimes people talk about full decriminalization. So maybe we can clarify what we mean by decriminalization, and also perhaps this is an opportunity to talk about your work specifically in answering that question, if that feels right for you. So we'll start with Candii.
Yes, hello everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we have a little bit of an echo, but we can hear you.
Okay, what about now? Do y'all still have that echo?
No, that's better.
Okay, great. I'm sorry, y'all. I had to jump on two different devices because my internet connection is currently unstable. So if I become robotic, please let me know.
Okay.
Um, to answer the question, to clear up, what is decriminalization? So decriminalization, the description for decriminalization of sex work is the removal of criminal penalties for sex trade participation that does not involve trafficking, including selling sex, buying sex, living with, working with, and associating with sex workers. Who is criminalized? No one, unless commit violence or exploitation. Examples, New Zealand and Australia, is examples that we can actually go by. So a little bit about the work that I am doing. Right now we are doing national and international work, but we are have been doing some work for the Walking While Trans and CA. California has been introduced. So we are dismantling that bill with individuals there on the ground, and we also doing international work in Kenya, where a lot of refugees is currently sex workers, but it's kind of hard for them to. It's anything. A lot of them is like a lot of their freedom fighters have is currently they get assaulted and put on fire. Right after they start to protest, any of sex work rights or trans rights or any type of rights that's considered LGBT and out the norm. So what we have been doing is, we have been doing trying to purchase land. Right now, what we done, we got them a safe house, and we're trying to purchase land so that within the land they could start, getting, chickens, turkeys, just different type of livestock to be able to start to make revenue there, because livestock and all of that is really where it's at there, and so that it can be able to start building and start getting volunteers and be able to navigate, because we know we have to have some type of money to be able to talk to these people or whatever like that. So so we trying to build some type of weapon that we could utilize to fight against the government, to be able to hear us, because they're gonna want a chicken, a turtle, or something, a goat, a pig, or horse, or something, or whatever like that from us. So I yield back.
Thank you so much for that. And if folks want to learn more about what's going on in Kenya, we also had a couple of activists from Kenya, sex worker organizers from Kenya, in our panel on Monday, and that's on hackinghustling.org. So yeah, and then I'll go next to, sorry, I'm trying to remember the order. Ivanalise.
Hey y'all, first I'm gonna start off by saying thank you to Laureline Cornell, say how excited I am to be here today with all of you. To answer your question, to me, the crime just means that there's no laws preventing us from choosing to do the labor of sex work. It means that there's no laws out there locking us up for how we choose to survive. There's a few different types of models out there, and it can be very confusing. I'm just starting to learn about them myself. But what my community has always known, even if we didn't know the official label for it, is that we shouldn't be made to feel shame or stigma for how we use our bodies as a form of labor. Decrim is us demanding human rights. Decrim is not the same as legalization. Some forms of legalization require us to register ourselves and be forced to take certain tests. Legalization only helps those of us in the most privileged situations. We don't want to have to work for a brothel or a club unless that is our choice. But legalization would often make those the only legal places to work. Many of them can be hired at a brothel or a club. Also, some people seem to think that it would help us access healthcare if we were forced to be tested. But our community is afraid of stigma. of healthcare because of stigma. And decrim is the best way to protect us from stigma and help us get the healthcare we want and need instead of pushing us further underground. We want healthcare, but force means fear. That's how I think. But legalization would often make the only legal places where many of us would never even be hired at a broad or a club.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
it's just force means fear. With decrim, there's a lot of stigma. If we eliminate decrim, less stigma, more access to all the resources we need.
Yeah.
Health, many more. Women's state, everyone's state is the mental health. That's where it starts.
Yeah.
That's how I think about it.
Yeah, I think these are such important points, remembering that it's not only about policing, it's also about accessing resources. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And Marika, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, echoing the sentiments that, and the clarification that's already been brought forward, that we're talking about removing criminal penalties from consensual services done in exchange for money or goods or anything that is needed, which is to say criminalizing survival. And often related to prostitution is also prostitution-related offenses that our work in Louisiana in the Deep South Decrim campaign also addresses 10 other prostitution-related offenses that often get people hung up in harassment and arrest and lead to incarceration, such as solicitation, inciting prostitution, promoting prostitution, prostitution by massage, operation of a place of prostitution, and uniquely, to archaic Louisiana is the Crimes Against Nature solicitation law that is also seeking to be repealed in the legislation that we're currently working on, which will hopefully be heard in the next 2 weeks as it goes in front of the Criminal Justice Committee in our House. And yeah, what Ivana Lee said, of course, we're always, I think we all are always doing clarification work around not creating a misnomer of decriminalization with legalization, or the ever insidious partial decrim, which is not partial at all, that is client criminalization models.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to hear that you have all of those provisions in your bill. That is really difficult to get sponsored, something so comprehensive. That's so great. Mike, I'd love to hear from you next.
Hey, when I talk about decrim, what I'm talking about, like on a bigger level, is about asking the state, or really demanding the state get their boots off of our necks, right? And that's part of it. So that's the policing, the over-policing, the surveillance, not just around, like other folks said, criminalization of sex work, but also all the things that come with a precarious life and how the state has just criminalized so many facets of poverty and just living a life that you don't fit into a mainstream with. And I think the other part of decrim is also building up what's not there, right? Like this isn't something that's happening in silo. It's not just, we're not just looking for a policy win, right? We're building a movement. And so even if we win or lose the policy, that's not necessarily the ultimate end game here, right? It's about building a movement. And so even if we lose in decrim mass, that like our community is better off for having fought this fight and banding together than for not, right? And then the last thing I would say is, like, especially in clarifying decrim, a lot of people think like they know what's best for public safety, right? Like cops know, and like these ancient old legislators, like they know, but they've had all this time to fix it and they haven't done it. And if you live through the system, that's not real public safety. And so I know that decrim mass is calling for more than just decrim of these laws. We're also looking for real, genuine public safety, and that includes housing for all, that includes universal income, that includes healthcare, right? All the things. And that is true, genuine public safety. And that's very much what Decrim is part of.
Absolutely. Thank you. Lakeisha, would you like to add something?
Ooh, everybody has covered it, and I love it. I love what everybody has said, right on to the inclusiveness of this movement that includes housing, rights. My thing with legalization, right, as a movement, we know that like people get it confused. Legalization puts the most marginalized folks at the mercy of the state continuously, where we have Black trans women, Black folks, period, immigrant folks here in the Deep South that are already at the mercy of the state, who will not be given certification for whatever reason. You know, it will still be a white capitalist male system that we know it to be, where white men in the industry consistently make money. We do have forms of legalizations of sex work here that exclude folks. We know that on Bourbon Street, they ain't taking trans people in those clubs. That specifically, they're not taking Black trans people in those clubs. They're not taking, and not to throw those workers under the bus. We love all of those workers. And we have to start and look at this movement from the bottom up, like who is the most affected, and then come from a movement from the bottom up and not the top down. That does not work. Decriminalization, on the other hand, puts those people first and center those voices as much as possible in the movement. So then we're looking at housing. We're looking at a state that has consistently enslaved Black folks that are caught up in the criminal justice system. And that's essentially what it is. It is a form of continued enslavement in Louisiana via the criminalization of sex workers and people trying to survive.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, my own work is very much around how white supremacy is at the root of anti-sex work law and rhetoric. And if you look back 100 years, you can see that explicitly in how these laws were created, laws that are still on the books and still being used to criminalize people. And so in my next question actually is also about talking about the white supremacist policing and criminalization that is specifically anti-trans. And so the question is, how has criminalization impacted your community? Or also another way to answer this is, what drives you in this fight? And, you know, I'm thinking about the intersections with fighting, the intersections with what some people think of as other movements. So like racial justice movements, TGNC justice movements, and how those are intertwined with ours. So Candii, would you like to speak to that?
Absolutely. When you called my name, my light just is actually dimmed a little bit. So yes, okay, I had to take a breath for that one. Being a transgender woman, and being a Black transgender woman has been the biggest hiccup of my life. Mm-hmm. Walking down the streets on stolen grounds, and constantly fighting for my humanity, to simply exist, and constantly fighting to own my God's given body. Mm-hmm. Has forced me to like so much trauma, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And that's just me speaking in eyes. What actually drives me to decriminalize sex work not only here in the state of New York, but nationally, is because 400 years ago, when that white man was going to the plantations to start his sexual exploitation of black bodies, that's on what we call now the farm. It was those white men that actually gave us the word prostitution. It was those white men that actually told our slave owners that they weren't going to come to our land unless there was a black woman going to give up her body to him. So now that we are in the 21st century, and not only that, let me stay back there a little bit, because back then, if women didn't have no husband, was not married, they was automatically thrown in the jails, because they was automatically assumed that they was prostitutes. So the white man is the one that gave us the prostitution name. And now it's so hard to speak about it. And it's so like, oh my goodness, don't talk about it. And I'm gonna say this and then I'm gonna yield back. Now that we own and we make and we are one of the highest paid in industries, and we making a living and we're surviving, it's simple, it's criminalized. And it's not fair. And I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that powerful statements. Yvonne Elise, would you like to answer the question? Yvonne Elise, I'm not sure, maybe you're talking, but you're muted. Yvonne Elise may be having technical difficulties. So maybe we'll go to Marika and then we'll come back to Yvonne Elise.
Yeah, thinking about, I just really situating myself in so-called New Orleans, Louisiana, in Belboncha. When we say that Louisiana as a state was built on the back of sex workers, we fucking mean it, right? That Louisiana sexual commerce began with French colonization, and that over 3 centuries of colonization and statehood, their laws and policies in Louisiana have permitted many different types of sexual commerce performed by both free and unfree laborers. And so, whereas so-called New Orleans has existed for 300 years, prosecution of sex work has only existed for about 100 years here, right? And it's include periods of legalization and periods of decriminalization. And there's always been a changing kind of status of sex work that includes forms of slavery, of sex work, of exotic dancing, of labor trafficking for sexual commerce. And in particular, Black women have borne the brunt of racialized, gendered state violence in this country and in this state in particular. And so, we're in our campaign, we're kind of seeking a return to the historic roots of decriminalization in Louisiana, which has a much longer history than a history of criminalization. Like Louisiana and New Orleans in particular is kind of somewhat notorious for its lawlessness. The city and state playfully advertises that narrative to the extent that it ushers in tourism dollars for the state to pocket while maintaining an obscenely low minimum wage of where tipped employees earn $2.13 an hour, right? And then it selectively enforces laws on the most vulnerable residents who are trying to survive, many of whom are in service economies for tourists and for locals, such as sex workers, right? And so, Louisiana ranks the third highest in the nation for poverty and child poverty rates, and stands number one as the highest incarceration rate in the country, with that, is situated in the country that has the highest incarceration rates in the world. And so, in Louisiana, where racial policing and prosecution and sentencing is so routinely racialized, the people that are often arrested for prostitution already face multiple intersecting issues of poverty, of disability, of illness, of immigration status, of housing instability, and exclusion from all different kinds of institutional supports, like, education and lending systems, et cetera, right? And so I'm for decriminalization because I adamantly oppose the state and its coercive systems of control and capture, point blank, right? And towards decriminalization for the autonomy and self-determination and liberation of us all. So the enforcement of laws criminalizing sex work, always leads to folks having, forced evictions and arbitrary arrests, investigations, all these fees and fines, and is very strategic on behalf of a white supremacist state seeking to basically make it a crime of poverty, right? And a crime of people restricting access to any kind of capital, right? Which is to say also access to power.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for also bringing in the continuation of this work with other labor issues. And, I do think that our work has to be deeply, it has to deeply intersect with work to get higher wages for all workers, to get resources to all workers. And, we are also, in the dealing with those same sort of constraints. I think I know that a number of us also turn to sex work because minimum wage work just isn't survivable. So thank you for that. Yvonne Elise, can you hear us?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Okay. So I'm not sure if you heard the question, but the question is really what drives you in this work?
What drives me into the work is criminalization creates massive barriers and obstacles in many of our lives. Like, it's prohibiting us from using our bodies as a certain form of labor. Being criminalized leaves a mark. That makes it impossible to access housing, healthcare resources. It even prevents us from leaving sex work if we eventually wanted to work a different type of job. I'm Puerto Rican. Latin Black people in my community are targeted just for walking around.
Yeah.
They specifically target us as people of color. Security, they harass us just for being in our neighborhoods. This means Latin people and people of color are most likely to be arrested. And when we are arrested, that's where it creates that mark, that barrier, where it literally just strips us from everything, the very well needed resources we need. Like, basically, it's the first step to protecting most of us and knocking down that barrier that is not allowing us to be allowed to be seen as humans. You get it? We should be allowed to be seen just as any other. Decriminalization, first step.
Absolutely. I love that it's the first step. I love thinking of this as such a larger journey. Mike, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. So, I work for an abolitionist organization. And so I feel like I really entered this space with that framework. And so when I was thinking about what I might want to be working on, and what would speak to my people and help them, sex work was one of the things that came to mind. And, you know, I reached out to Whose Corner Is It Anyway, and we all agreed like this is something we would want to work on together. And so we formed this coalition, Decrim Mass. And for anyone who doesn't know, I mean, if you're a sex worker on the call, I'm sure you know. But for everyone else, you know, this is really something that LGBT folks rely on who are already part of a historically marginalized group. So like even the National Center for Trans Equality came out with a survey in 2015, and they found like 11% of trans folks in general engaged in sex work. But then when we look at that intersection for Black and brown folks, it's 40%, right? And that's actually the same number that Black and Pink got when we did a survey of our inside members who are currently incarcerated. About 40%, it was 39%, indicated they had done sex work as well. And so I just felt a lot of solidarity with them. Yeah. And then in terms of the second part of that question, I found that interesting. A friend mentioned something like that to me earlier today. And I actually find it almost to be the opposite, that like it is with it as like trans communities build power, sex workers build power. I feel like the right is like just attacking that, right? This is like a backlash to the growing power happening in our communities. I know I've been able to witness it, you know, at least in the last 5 years, this kind of growing swell of power and like demand that the state stop doing what it's doing to us. And so we've seen that too, like across time, right? Like even in like the Warren Court, when they did all these great Supreme Court rulings in favor of Black and brown folks and criminalized folks, there was like an immediate backlash, right? In the media and stuff. And so this is sort of part and parcel for how white supremacy works, you know, as they try to grapple and clutch onto power in response to us when we are building our own power. And so we could maybe reframe that in some way as like a sign of success, that they are scared of us, that we are on their radar, and that we are coming for what's ours.
Yes, I love that. Thank you. Lakeisha, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, so Decrim for me is because the people that I love historically, currently, are sex workers. I think it was Bell Hooks that said the personal is always political. And for me, as a second generation sex worker who knew my mother to be a sex worker so that I can survive, and that I was a sex worker so that my daughter could survive. And that my daughter is a sex worker currently so that she can maintain that survival, and has been criminalized in Louisiana system. It's deeply personal for me. But also poverty and white supremacy is generational, right? And that survival, that need to survive, has been generational since my people have gotten here, since they were human trafficked over here. So if we really want to go into human trafficking, we can start from that narrative and work our way up to today and the need for survival. So by the personal being political, all of the folks that are really close to me have had to do whatever they needed to do to survive. And this carceral system that continues to enslave my people consistently for acts of survival, for trying to get out of poverty, for feeding their children, for doing what they need to have housing in a moment where housing is of the essence of community survival, not just individual survival, community survival, and are being thrown out of housing because they can't make the rent, because they can't make money. I think that everybody is looking at survival in those various different ways and seeing how we can collectively come up. So I think that right now, we are in a critical moment. Like, yes, we are definitely owning our power, but also those who have been in power have also had to survive on some level and taking up space that historically sex workers have used in order to survive, like OnlyFans and all of the things. So everybody's rethinking like, oh, this is what sex workers and organizers have been telling us for years. That one, we get ownership over our bodies, and two, we have to come up with ingenious ways in order to survive. And it has taken a freaking pandemic for eyes to be open, but I believe that we're in a critical space so we can have these more important conversations to push our world to do better by us as a collective. Now, going into racial justice and all of these other justice issues, if we can just come to the table and realize like we are not scarce in resources, that's the number one thing. Like this world has an abundance of resources, and we can collectively yield power so that white supremacy no longer has domination over our bodies and controls over our minds, and we can envision a different world. The time is right now where Black people are continuously being killed, people of color are continuously being killed, trans folks are continuously being killed. We can narrate a different world, y'all. We can push for a different world.
I'm having chills. Just, the radical imagining of a liberated future, I think is something that drives me. That is, and also is deeply personal, is deeply related to the impacts of criminalization on the people I love. So yeah, thank you so much for that vision. So the next question is, so the next question is about the client criminalization models that some folks are calling partial criminalization. You guys have already brought this up. And I would love if you could talk a little bit about the differences between decriminalization and the client criminalization model, which is, I'll also add, in Massachusetts, in New York, there are competing bills. We have decriminalization bills, and then we have competing bills that call themselves the equality model bill, which get rid of criminalization of selling sexual services, but continue to criminalize the buying of sexual services. So the industry is still policed and criminalized. So I would love to hear, Candii, I know you have a lot of experience talking about this. Could you, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So, so there's three main legal models. The first model is the model that we all support, which is the decriminalization model. Decriminalization, the description is the removal of criminal penalties for sex trade participation that does not involve trafficking, including selling sex, buying sex, living with, working with, and associating with sex workers. Who is criminalized? No one, unless committed violence or exploitations. These are examples of the New Zealand and Australia. The second model is the legalization model. The description is a strict regulation of what is considered illegal versus legal. Sex work often includes licenses and registration requirements. Who is criminalized? Trans women, migrants, street-based workers, immigrants, and many, many more.
Mhm.
The third model is the model that just got introduced into legislation 2 weeks ago. And who in the state of New York, there's only one senator that's on that bill. Her name is Liz Kruger. The description of the Nordic model / and demand model / equality model / full decrim model / not on my watch. This description is it seeks to end trade by ending demand for it. Removal of criminal penalties for selling sex, but maintains or increases criminal penalties for buying sex and living with, working with, associating with sex workers, including sex workers themselves. Who is criminalized? Everyone,
Mm.
including sex workers themselves.
Yeah.
Examples: Sweden, France, Ireland.
Mhm.
I yield back.
It's such an important point that these models often include criminalization of sex workers themselves through criminalization of sex workers living together, that would fall under oftentimes brothel keeping laws or bawdy house laws, and recognizing that sex workers living together and working together is also a safety practice, a harm reduction practice. Yvonne Elise, I'd love to hear from you about the difference between decriminalization and the client criminalization model.
Client criminalization means more danger for us sex workers. Client criminalization makes it impossible for us to be able to work in safer areas of our towns without the fear that it creates by keeping our clients safe from the cops. When we have to hide, protect the client, we're also hiding from each other. We're in a more dangerous predicament at the fact that we can't support each other. We can't even teach each other how to stay safe without the fear of being criminalized.
Mm-hmm.
Most important things to me is stigma, and stigma kills. We don't need another model that tells us we're just victims who can't make our own decisions. These models may change the stigma of criminalization a bit, but they don't get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
The stigma with criminalization is that we are all bad people who should be arrested. The stigma with client criminalization is that we don't have the ability to take care of ourselves and that we don't have the right to make our own choices. That's how I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for illuminating the theory behind the model as well. I'd love to go to Marika.
Yeah, client criminalization models. The other day I was talking to someone, going off on how sometimes they're referred to as like partial decrim and how it's just like absurd. And they're like, yeah, it's really like shift crim. You know what I mean? It's the shift crim model, right? So, and most absurdly and insidiously now, this new language of equality model that's coming out, because the buyers are considered criminals, right? And so they may be arrested and prosecuted. So this model continues to increase surveillance and policing of sex workers and their workplaces, which leads to isolation and the limited negotiating power for safety, for rates, because the law enforcement is going to be out to arrest clients. So there's actually pushes people out into more potentially seedy and unsafe situations, right? And this is often, the solution that's being brought forward by folks who conflate sex working with sex trafficking and this kind of tirade of misguided anti-sex work, anti-trafficking folks with a lot of money and a lot of microphone time that are insisting sex workers need rescuing from their means of surviving under capitalism, right? that they're so often they're like, yes, you should not experience violence on the job. Yes, you should have bodily autonomy, right? And so we will criminalize your way of surviving, right? The other side of the equation in a consensual service exchange is then, targeted. And, this continues to position women in particular as weak or damaged subjects, giving this renewed legitimacy to patriarchally motivated discourses of control and protection. And, citing sort of pretty dubious facts and statistics, the folks who are often advocating for client criminalization models ignore what the decriminalization legislation is actually about, which is like the removing criminal penalties, which in fact makes sex workers vulnerable to the very things opponents say they're against, right? Trafficking, crime, violence, exploitation, right? And two, I think it's important that we, firstly, I want to center erotic laborers and, the workers in the sex trade. But I think it's also important to recognize that clients come from all different backgrounds with many different needs and many different behavioral actions and how they interact with sex workers, and that sex workers service intra-community clientele. So it's not just like saving distraught victims or saving people of color from rich white men, as many of the advocates of client criminalization will subtly proclaim, right? It's that the state and all of its apparatuses are the biggest threats to sex workers' well-beings, right? So the criminal penalties can, siphon resources into the carceral system in the form of client prosecution that could instead be used towards community needs, right? Or to provide non-punitive and non-judgmental services that actually do benefit sex workers.
Yeah, it is so, that is such a frustration to see those resources wasted when we know the need that we're surrounded by and the economic precarity of the people we love. Yeah, that is something that is so painful. Mike, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, the equality model. Ooh, so that really gets my goose because it is co-opting, like LGBT movements. And like even doing just a quick survey of like national LGBT orgs, like most are on board with us. They call for full decrim, not like partial decrim, not equality model. It's not LGBT people promoting the equality model. It's like these white girls who work at these in-demand organizations who are touting it out. And so it is infuriating to see that. And then like here in Massachusetts specifically, we saw them touting this out and then trying to sell it to LGBT legislators as like LGBT friendly. And, thank God for the work of the coalition we're in. Like we had to go in, like for some reason we found out that they were approaching LGBT legislators. And so we spent the vast majority of our energy playing defense, trying to convince the LGBT legislators to not file it, that like y'all are being duped. This like no LGBT people asked for this. It's not what they're making it sound like. We're actually looking for liberation, and this isn't that path. And so thankfully we were able to beat some of those legislators back. But ultimately, and this kind of falls into the second part of the question, like a lesbian legislator is the one who ended up filing it. And this is a same legislator who also like spearheaded a new prison in Massachusetts, despite a lot of opposition from LGBT orgs, right? And so it's like the second wave feminists that like just think they know what's best for other women. Just seeing that like play out again and again. And it's a disappointment. I want to be like, what are you doing? We're your people. Like, sis, come on. And so that's really, really frustrating. And unfortunately, we spent so much time trying to play defense on those bills, that I think it set us our work back a little bit, you know. And so we've really had to reframe our work and be like, you know what, we're going to do a pro us campaign and not just focus on them, because you know, just selling liberation is a lot better and more powerful than you know, just trying to talk people out of that work.
Yeah. Sorry, did you have more to say? I didn't mean to.
I will just add that in Massachusetts too, like there is actually a split between the LGBT movement orgs. And so that's something that we're definitely working on. We have most of the LGBT, all the trans orgs are on our side. All the trans people, they've come to these meetings, they've poured their hearts out in support of decrim. But it's the orgs that actually aren't attached to people, that actually don't do direct services or like don't directly work with people. They're like policy orgs, like mass equality, like they don't even serve anybody. We got marriage long time ago, they could have folded the doors, but they still want to like take positions on policy as if they know, you know, it's the same framework, like as if you know what's best for us, like the people who are selling cheeks out there, and they don't. And so anyways, my personally goal is to like actually mend that rift and make sure that all the LGBT orgs are on the same side and on the side of liberation in this.
It's such important work. Thank you so much for doing that work, Mike. Yeah, and to echo what both of you have said, I mean, the rhetoric that has been said to me, lobbying and, you know, speaking to folks who support the end demand bill is so objectifying, and being told, you know, that I don't understand my own experience, that either I am too traumatized or I'm not traumatized enough. You know, my experience includes trafficking, experience with trafficking. I have trouble saying that word. It's still not quite, it doesn't, I only use it because I recently learned what the law says about what trafficking is and recognize that that is an experience that I've had that, you know, in my mind was just really a really shitty work experience. But so I have talked about some of these experiences to legislators who claim that what they want is to protect people from violence, and tried to describe that, in my mind, the only way to protect sex workers from violence is to allow us to be open and to organize with each other. And yes, the dismissiveness has been so frustrating. Lakeisha, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so right on, Mike, for naming these carceral feminists, because that's what it is. Feminists who are so ingrained with we have to save women, and connecting that to the movement to defend police officers that have been historically and currently harmful in Black and brown communities, in poor communities. So carceral feminism, second wave feminism in particular, but definitely, which comes out of second wave thought, right? Around saving women. But carceral feminism wants to lock everyone up in this blanketed carceral state. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, for me, I think about, you know, how do you lock up an economy? Like the clients, we're asking you to decrim so that we can make money. Like it doesn't make sense. First of all. Second of all, who asked for partial freedom? Mm-hmm. Nobody seeking freedom, liberation, justice is asking for you to give them a corner of that freedom and liberation and justice. We are asking for full decrim as a means for full justice and liberation work. And we don't need other people to speak to that, right? But we would like for you to align with, if you are seeking freedom and justice and liberation, please align with sex workers who are seeking freedom, justice, and liberation. It is not that hard. It is not rocket science. We can all push together cohesively.
Yes. I love that. Thank you. I have one last question, and we may have time for an audience question if folks want to put a question into the chat or into the Q&A. And so the last question is that sex worker movements have had a long history of protesting policing in the United States. I mean, they call the march in San Francisco in, oh Lord, I've forgotten the year, 1907, I think. That they call it the first Women's March. So a long history of protesting policing. And to me, it sometimes feels like we are having the same discussions over and over again for 100 years. And so much of our politics now and our discourse now is shaped by the politics of the late 19th and early 20th century, right after the passage of the Reconstruction amendments, when immediately attention turned to what was called then white slavery, and the passage of the bill in 1910 called the White Slave Traffic Act, which is still in use today. They've changed the name to the Mann Act, but it is the part of the law that FOSTA amended. And I also want to say, so in addition to this frustration with conversations happening over and over again, I do see, and you guys have already talked about this, that conversations about decrim have a new resonance in the public. And I really think we're gaining ground. Do you guys see that as well? And I'll start with Candii.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, it was so crazy because when I want to say you sat next to me when we first introduced this
That's
bill.
right. Yeah.
That was you, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Yes. So, oh my goodness, when we first introduced this bill into legislation here in New York, when you sat next to me, you was telling me, you was like, Candii, this is a big deal, right? And I was like, no.
I know, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm like, no. And then I immediately had to like use the restroom and stuff and like get my stuff together. But no, so when this bill got introduced, I didn't know what was happening. Like I didn't like all of the, actually when I got into it and doing the research and seeing like really what's happening here, it was well overdue. And and it's and I'm proud to say here in the state of New York, since we introduced the bill, we have 20 co-sponsors on the bill. That is huge.
Yeah.
And it's so huge to the point where if the Nordic model wanted to try to attempt to come through, we already done put up a block because we have over 20 co-sponsors or whatever like this. So we already got the shield up. So now it's for us educate and but see what's happening there. A lot of individuals know that decriminalization of sex work is really, really hot here in New York. And it really became something that, a tool where we have actually been educated so many individuals and still so many more individuals to go that we have individuals that will run against someone if they are anti, because they know that it's so much the conversation about decriminalization of sex work and this and that, and then they want the co-sponsors, and so it's a lot, but it's a good lot because it's furthermore in the conversation. And not only is it in the conversation, the full decriminalization of sex work is what's in the conversation, and that's what's winning. And it's I'm glad to see not only is it here in New York, but I want to say Massachusetts, what is it, Washington, D.C., California, Tennessee, Georgia, there's so many. It's becoming a domino effect, and individuals is really coming together as unity. And there's so many different elected officials that's learning from, elected officials here on how do you talk to, your constituents, about it, so we can feel comfortable. Like, what is the language? So, this is really, really, I want to say congratulations to everyone that is currently on the ground educate and the uneducated and the uneducated that's willing to get educated. So I would like to say like thank you to everyone because this is a powerful movement. And once we decriminalize sex work and the state of here in New York, it's going to be decriminalized in Massachusetts, Virginia. It's going to be a domino effect. Look at me. I yield back.
Yes. Yes. Boy. Candii, that moment when we were next to each other when they were introducing the bill, and I remember you sort of saying something like, oh, I don't know, it's not a big deal. And I just thought, you know what? That's great. It's not a big deal. This is what we should expect. Like that is actually maybe the attitude. I've been doing this for so many years and have felt so frustrated that I was just like, oh my God, having a politician say decriminalization to me is like a huge get, but that's not enough. And, I was really actually inspired by your attitude. So great. Sorry, we have a new order of. Okay, so next I'd like to hear from Rika.
Yeah, I'm like hyped, right? Because it's true, being in the struggle for so long, for myself, 16 years of being like, we're fucking tired, and we're going to keep fighting because we have to, but to continuously be demystifying, sex work and sex trafficking, to coming back against legalization and feeling in this repetition that we can often lose sight of the fact that we have had enormous victories and many miracles, not least of which have been like an incredible network of subversive criminals who care for each other and find ways of like existing and of thriving and of celebrating outside of any state legitimacy. And that's like a power that they cannot take away from us. And so we recognize that the criminalization of people marginalized by cis, heteronormative, white nationalist, patriarchal, capitalist systems will continue even after decriminalization of sex work related offenses, right? And like the abolitionist perspective demands that we continue to struggle to dismantle interlocking systems of oppression in there entirely, right? And while continue to invest in like the ongoing safety and like love of our, the most marginalized folks in our communities, right? And so decriminalization is one of the many ways that we're advocating for freedom and justice and liberation. And I feel like there's a long history of sex workers' rights organizing and so much deep gratitude to the sweat, tears, and love of our sex working ancestors that have allowed for more cross-movement organizing efforts to come about, with like sex work being talked about in harm reduction, being talked about as intrinsically linked to queer and trans liberation, and into defunding and dismantling and abolishing the police. It's like the police from the very beginning have existed to patrol people of color. Their roots are inextricable from white supremacy and state violence, right? And so they've long been tyrannically harassing and killing people of color, but the conversation has shifted enormously in the past couple of years. You've got moms with ACAB shirts on and stuff, and it's like in no small part due to like an extraordinary amount of effort of grassroots movements, like the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, to refuse the state apparatus of racist hyperviolence, right? And that also emerged alongside, you know, a staggering rise in fascism in the past couple of years, where I think like it's been a necessary people's clapback taking place on a large scale, where people are less willing to accept powerlessness and to bash back on the attack against bodily autonomy along a lot of lines, you know, including the sex industry. You know, I'm thinking about like Audre Lorde writing about how like in order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt or distort those like various sources of power within culture of the oppressed, so that they can like, that can provide energy for change. Right. And so like this repression has been very targeted, this suppression has been very targeted, and in no small part, like marginalized folks having access to capital outside of the state, which is considered, you know, a source of power and information. And yeah, you know, and two, I think that like the changing landscape of, you know, as much as we're in like a cybernetic hellhole kind of these days, and that's continuously monitored and surveilled and attacked. There's also been a lot of allowance for sex workers to collaborate in different ways, and for self-publishing of our experiences and our perspectives, that has really normalized as we like fight for humanity to just recognize like we are people, right? There's been much some not full eradication, but in some ways like veils lifted by our technological presence, you know? So I agree, right? We're in a really critical moment, you know, like Keisha was saying with the pandemic, people recognizing, oh shit, yeah, we all got to work and survive under this heinous capitalist system. And why are we spending resources attacking people who are just trying to maintain, right? And the belief that, yeah, we have to like narrate our future and not just look for acceptance and legitimacy through the state's lens, you know, that we have to counter plan really so that we can live and survive in the long term, you know.
Absolutely. I think this is also so important in this discussion, to talk about the networks of care that we've created in order to survive, and that those networks are going to feed our radical imagining of the future. And I know that just in my own work that I'm very drawn to continuing to build networks of care outside of state infrastructure. And sometimes I feel like that's all I want to do. And I don't want to do this policy work. I don't want to talk to civilians, you know? But you know, obviously both are very important. So Mike, I'd love to hear from you.
I mean, yeah, to all that. I kind of touched on it earlier, right? Like as the trans rights movements like build steam, yeah, I see sex workers building steam. There's something totally interrelated there. And, you know, like shout out to all the women in my life who have like inspired me, educated me. I'm thinking about the National LGBT and HIV Criminal Justice Working Group, which is like way too long of a name, but like Kate D'Adamo's on there, right? And I remember joining up like 3 or 4 years ago thinking like, wow, she's crazy, you know, even though I had been a sex worker, you know, and I was like, I don't want to say anything to her, but like, and then she's like cross-pollinating in this group, right, of like getting people comfortable, educating people. And I'm like, well, maybe it is okay for me to admit like I started my activism work with my escort money, or whatever, right? And like
as we all did, as we all continue to do. I mean, how
that's a whole panel. That's a whole panel discussion on its own.
Yeah.
And so like super grateful for her work, extraordinarily grateful for Whose Corner Is It Anyway. That was what I was gonna say, is like they've been doing this dope ass mutual aid work for so long that they have created like a fertile soil there, right? And like the next natural progression in my eyes is for them to start standing up against the state, right? They take care of each other and then they say, wait, okay, we could do this to infinity, right? Or we could tell them to knock it off. And so it's been really exciting to collaborate with them. and build out their portfolio of work, right? And now they're getting into advocacy and policy. And they're really like the main inspiration for me personally to even be engaging in this. And so, yeah, just shout out to all the women out there leading this work. Yeah, none of this would happen without y'all. So thank you for holding it down.
Thank you. Lakeisha, I'd love to hear from you.
So I'm gonna make it quick because I want to yield time for people to ask conversations. But I just want to shout out to all the queer, trans, non-binary people who have historically done mutual aid and support of survival of community, who has taught me to do such work in the survival of my children as a queer person, and raising them in a household that was unapologetic about our survival and who we were. So I realized that the work and the foundation in which we stand on are the shoulders of those people. And this continued work that we are doing, sometimes those people don't need to show up, don't want to show up. Many are just trying to survive and wait this fucked up system out, right? Because we know it's on its last leg. A lot of people have been doing the work for years and years and years. So for those that can stand up, then we do stand up. And when it's time for us to step back, we should always step back, give ourselves a reprieve to look at the work anew. It's something maybe we didn't see while doing the work. I know while pushing this campaign, I have had to be like, no calls, no texts, no nothing.
Yes.
So that I can come back in my best self, as my best healed self, as much as possible. So self-care is critical, and we needn't look that far. We can look to our loves and the queer, transgender, non-binary folks who have been giving us the way forward for a long, long time.
It's so true. I always think about Compton's Cafeteria and the fierce women there who just decided to not yield to the police. And that is a deep inspiration for me. And like thinking about queer movements as a source of our movement. Ivana Elise, I'd love to hear from you if your tech is back.
Yes, ma'am.
Great.
Sorry. So yeah, honestly, I'll be honest. I haven't been fighting long enough for Decrim to notice the changes that Lorelai's talking about, but I can talk about it on how my community views it.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't use Decrim, but we always know that decriminalization is bad for us. We don't want to get arrested. We don't want a record, let alone we don't want our babies or our lives taken away, because society is defining us as inhuman because of how we earn our income. We don't see ourselves as slaves. We never did. We want our community to be included in national conversations about sex work. I would have more to tell you about that history of conversation about sex work, but my community and I were purposely excluded from those conversations. We've had the answers all along. I don't think that how we use our bodies as a specific form of labor should shame society. I think society is shamed by how it's treating the most vulnerable people. That's how I see it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So we just have 5 minutes and we have one question from the audience. The question is, what does it mean that the equality bill was just reintroduced last week in New York? Will it disappear because there are not enough co-sponsors? So Candii, do you have a perspective on that?
Yes. So I want to answer that question. After I answer that question, I do want to give a shout out. It's just like really, really touching my heart.
Yeah.
So to answer the question, it was introduced 2 weeks ago. And Liz Kruger, she's the senator of the particular bill. And Liz Kruger the marijuana just got, went through, repealed, legalized here in the state of New York. So that was one of her main bills.
Yeah.
So now that, she has a little bit more times on her hand, there's a possibility that, she might try to, but she can't, but we have 20 elected officials. So what we're doing now is we're on the ground, and we're going to the other elected officials, and actually doing what we have to do. And then we also have elected officials who agree to stand with decriminalization of sex work, but due to their constituents and all of that, they can't publicly or get on paper just yet. When it hit the floor, they'll pass it or whatever like that. So we probably have like one or two of those or whatever like that. So we got them we got our heel in their neck. And in a way, so we just have to continue to fight and continue to educate. And and the most important piece of the cake is letting it be led by the Black and brown impacted folks. Yeah. We have the individuals here in legislation. That's how we were able to successfully repeal the Walking While Trans folks. We have the legislation, the Black and brown progressive folks here in the state of New York that's progressive enough to most definitely stand and get this bill passed. So we have it, but there is a fight. Mm-hmm. But I do want to give a shout out, and I want to give a shout out to Charles. Charles is in Nairobi, Kenya. It is 2:30 a.m. Do you hear me? It's 2:30 a.m. and Charles is here with us.
Amazing.
That is something and it's like touching my heart. And Charles, I have an organization out there, Black Trans Nation Kenya. RTI the Refugees Trans Initiative is out there. So I would love for you to get connected. I don't know mentally if you was reading anything that I was saying, but you gave me all your contact information. And I want to say thank you for that, because I was most definitely noting it. And I have a lot of individuals that gave me shout outs, and I would like to say thank you all so much. And I did not know I was that loved. So just thank y'all so much.
Oh man, everywhere I go, everybody's talking about how great you are. You're amazing. Yeah, we love you. Thank you, Candii. So I mean, does anyone in 2 minutes want to say how censorship on digital platforms shapes your ability to organize? Anyone
I would just real quick respond that for at least organizing for Decrim, it's mostly above board. And so I don't see it interfering in that way. We use just typical platforms. It's above board. And actually what I find is just a little of the opposite. Folks who are so used to being on the low, they have to relax a little bit coming out. Actually, there's nothing wrong fighting for liberation. There's actually nothing wrong with what we're doing or saying. And so it's a little actually relaxing into just mainstream communication forms.
So it seems like there's a continuation between online censorship as how it stigmatizes people and makes folks feel uncomfortable talking, and all the other things that are stigmatizing, policing, etc. And, for folks to feel comfortable coming forward, are fighting against all of those things. Guys, I have to thank you all for having this amazing finale to our conference. There's so much wisdom here, and I'm just so inspired by this conversation and so grateful for all of you and all of the work that you're doing and everything you've shared here tonight. So thank you so much. Just thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. So much love.
Yeah. And so that we're coming to the end of our panel discussion, and thanks to everyone in the audience. Thanks to just everyone for being here, and we're going to move forward, keep going.
Thank you, Lorelai.
Thank you.
Lorelai. Thank you all the organizers and panelists. Keep fighting and keep loving up on each other.
Yes.
Thank you all. Thank you. I love you all. Thank you.
Love you. Good night.